there's this call that like we're given this gift of life and we're not getting it back. Like the clock is ticking.
Mm-hmm.
And every moment we have the ability to plant a seed or water a seed that's in our garden. But every moment that passes is a moment missed or a harvest missed or a piece of food missed in the future. And, I've said this before, just as a reminder, you're living in the results of the actions and choices you made 90 days ago. So what are you choosing today?
Hello and welcome to another episode of the RevRx podcast, where we discuss how to thrive in faith, family, and health. My name is Chad Potts, and I'm your host. Our special guest today is George Bryant. You're going to love George. You're going to love his story. George is a former Marine. He's a New York Times bestselling author. He is a top-ranked podcast host. He's a highly sought-after digital marketing coach. He's a phenomenal human being. And one thing that you're going to learn about him is that he has a story that's truly a pain-to-purpose story. You're going to learn how he lost everything, 7 figures, in the global pandemic. And you're going to learn what he's done to kind of revamp his life lately, which includes, spoiler alert, getting right with his relationship with God. George is a talented man. He's a man of faith. And he's someone who I've truly come to know and admire. So without further ado, I introduce to you my friend, George Bryant. The George Bryant is here with us. Man, what a privilege it is to have you on the RevRx podcast today.
Brother, I'm honored to be here, and I also love the amount of detours that we've taken to get this show on the road and reschedules, and I'm so blessed that we're here.
I know. I was thinking, man, we're finally doing this. We've had a couple of reschedules, and lots has gone on in my world in the last few weeks, and so thank you for your patience, man. This is worth the wait.
Oh, bro, the 20 minutes, and just so everybody listening, the first 20 minutes was us bonding for life and in tears and sharing life stories. That was worth it alone. Like the podcast is just the dessert on top.
That's right. Well, yeah, usually it's like, hey, how you doing? Let's go. But we connect on a lot of different levels. Always been really drawn towards you, George, and the work that you're doing. And so I just want to say, first of all, thank you. Thank you for your honesty, for your truth, for the life that you're living, and for the transparency that you put out into the world. It's refreshing, and we need that. So when I had the opportunity to have you here on the show, man, I jumped at that.
Yeah, brother. It's I just want to also receive and thank you, because there's a lot of times where, we were talking before the show, and, for everybody who listens to this, that, imposter syndrome and self-doubt and all these things take over, and, even the quote unquote statuses of the world. And quite frankly, it feels like freedom to live radically exposed and expressed. And on the same side, there's also the inverse of that coin. And so hearing it and feeling it is a very, very received gift on my side, because it can feel lonely at times and feel like an echo chamber. And it definitely is the reason that I'm the happiest I've ever been. In the midst of, what some would call hurricanes and storms and life. But like, in my opinion, it's like 30 years of personal development work all collapsed in one moment. And it's like, hey, you don't really need to read it anymore. Like maybe pick up the tools that you've used and start using them. And the results are wonderful. But I think the most important thing is that I feel like myself.
Yeah. Wow. And there's no better feeling than that. Becoming who you were put on this earth to be. Love it. Well, man, your story is really like a prime example of a pain to purpose story. And it's still living it, it's still working itself out, right? Yeah. I wonder if you could just kind of take us through. I like to ask my guests, how did you get to where you are today? And that I realize that may take 6 hours.
Yeah, so we might have like version 2, version 3, but I think what I'll do, and I've practiced this before, and by practice meaning I've just done a lot of podcasts. I'll give the short version, but
sounds good.
I think the best place, and this is to give our dear friend Brian Bogert, credit. I think before I even share any of it, I think the one takeaway that I think is the most important is that there really never is a finish line. And the moment that you think there is, you've lost the race. And Brian, who's an incredible friend of mine who I love, and if you listen to Brian, we both love you.
Absolutely.
he gives a talk that I've seen him give in person so many times, and knowing his story, that you have to embrace pain to avoid suffering. I think a lot of my life, and just to kind of throw it all out on the table right now, even in the early days of me being interviewed on podcasts in 2010, right? I've done over like 10,000 shows. I used to sensationalize my story because it was how people would value me, and that wound of, can somebody just love me? Can somebody just like appreciate me? Like my value is only as good as like the results I create or the pain that I've gone through, right? Like never really knowing how to be in relationship or love. And so, there's this part now in hindsight, looking back as a, 40-year-old man and the happiest I've ever been, that also realizes that like every ounce of my story was a chapter to bring me to this perspective. And it's changed my relationship to be almost hungry for it, to where I seek out the blind spots, the hidden spots, to like just be the bison and what comes up, from a biblical sense. I see it all the time, and even from like a personal development sense. But the short version is, my childhood was interesting, to say the least. Had a lot of drug abuse around me, physical abuse, some sexual abuse, and pretty much self-sufficient-ish around like 13. Social services was involved. And I think you'll get this, and this is something that I've come to really sit with as of late, is that for some reason as a kid, like at a very early age, I was like, this isn't my life. Like, this isn't how I want to be. Like, I was never called to do drugs. I was never called to be a part of it. I was bullied. My nose was broken 3 times. My front teeth were knocked out 2 to 3 times. Like, I went through the ringer, but it never affected me to go down the bad path. And so I struggled with weight issues. I was massively overweight from the sexual abuse. I struggled with bulimia and an eating disorder for like probably 16 years of my life. And then at some point I was like, I need to get out of here. And I was like, I did this thing of like, I need to prove to myself that I can make it. And so I joined the Marine Corps, of all places, right? Like, let's take a broken childhood and turn you into more of a broken weapon, right? Where feelings aren't allowed, but there was this structure. And so I left as soon as I barely made it through high school, and I didn't really graduate. And God bless my teachers who still listen to my podcast. They passed me. Wow. Because I missed like 100+ days my senior year, because I was working 2-3 jobs and just trying to get out of there, and joined the Marine Corps and did 13 years on active duty in the Marine Corps. And to no one's surprise, excelled at my career, because I had Napoleon complex 101 of like, my value is only as good as I am. And so it was like, be the best in everything. And throughout that situation, in 2004, and I was in Somalia, I almost lost both my legs. You'll know this potentially with your background, but I got 1 in a billion chance in Somalia, bilateral exercise-induced compartment syndrome simultaneously.
Wow.
And don't Google it, everybody, and don't Google the surgeries if you have a weak stomach. And, they basically told me like, hey, you're never going to walk again. We need to amputate your legs. You're going to get medically separated. And I was more afraid of going back to nothing than I was of doing it. And so I ended up spending like 12 months in a wheelchair, had 6 surgeries, got a second opinion. And they're like, all right, well, you can save your legs, but they won't be functional. And in that process, my opiate addiction went through the roof, right? I had a PCA pump for 6 months. So I was basically made into an opiate addict, right? And then I was taking, on some days, like 50, 60 hydrocodone a day, 10 325s, like. And so that led to the first, basically, I'm going to be in integrity with this. The cry for help that I masked as a suicide attempt by overdosing and not doing it the way that I could have, but I really never wanted to, but I didn't know how to ask for help. And so I ended up 100 pounds overweight, 270 pounds at 5'7", and the Marine Corps is like, hey, we're going to get rid of you. And that is actually the catalyst that triggered me to be like, I need to get better, because I don't want to go back. And so I ended up over the next 6 months learning how to walk again, lost the weight, and went back on active duty for 8 more years. And then further excelled in my career. My father, who became my best friend, but not as my father after my childhood of not speaking to my mother for 15 years and watching them attack each other in court and lawsuits and drug addictions, got diagnosed with metastatic brain and lung cancer in 2008, March 5th of 2008 to be exact. And the Marine Corps flew me home on a humanitarian transfer. to be his primary caregiver. And so then I got to reparent my father and spend the last couple months of his life with him and really faced my entire childhood. And he passed away. And then I adopted my little brother, moved him back to Hawaii with me. And within a couple of weeks of being back, they're like, hey, you're going to California and you're going to Afghanistan. And so ended up back in Cali, then back in Afghanistan. And then Afghanistan rocked me pretty hard. And I had it easy compared to a lot of my friends, but I lost quite a few Marines to suicide, got a couple traumatic brain injuries, and something shifted in me in Afghanistan, though, where I was forced to face the fact that, and this is going to sound really crazy, I was too afraid to take my life, but I was basically slowly killing myself every which way that you could imagine. And it was the loss of my father and being in that country and witnessing the things that I saw that really shifted my perspective. And I was like, I don't want to be sick anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. And I didn't also want to tell anybody. And so I started finding CrossFit and health and paleo, and came home from Afghanistan and really struggled. I had a lot of bleeding on my brain, fluid on my brain. I would pass out from the pain. It was all over the place. I was on every medication you can imagine. I was giving myself Imitrex injections every day. I was getting Botox every 6 weeks. I was doing everything I could for my brain. And finally, the Marine Corps is like, hey, you're not going to really make it because you're kind of like damaged goods at this point. But I had found this desire to be healthy. And so I started teaching myself how to cook. And I needed accountability. So I made a Facebook page in 2010 with a fake college email address because I didn't go to college. And I started just documenting and posting recipes. And I did that consistently for a year or so. And then the Marine Corps is like, hey, you're out after 13 years and not retired, separated. So no benefits, nothing on that bucket. But this thing had been created. And so I kind of transitioned into a new addiction, which was entrepreneurship, right? And in looking back in hindsight, it was basically the trauma of my childhood never faced to then, let me go join the Marine Corps, use that for fuel, stack it on top, witness 2-3 suicides, lose 28 Marines to suicide, navigate my addictions, navigate all of those to, wait, now I'm going to go be an entrepreneur and I have this brand new addiction to pour into, which no wonder I was successful in the beginning, right? Because I took that same work ethic. And so then I became a food blogger. And 2 years after never cooking, I was a New York Times bestselling cookbook author, #1 app in the world, had, 500,000 social media followers, a couple million people a month on my website, and basically built this massive empire that was completely out of alignment with who I was. And I was, emotionally cheating on my spouse at the time by just being available to everybody but my family. And then everything collapsed when she got pregnant with my son, and I'd never faced anything. And then that's where really the dark night of the soul really started, because I was kicked out of the house. I had lost everything. I was driving that business into the ground. And then I did partake in plant medicine, and it really did help me and save my life. But what ended up happening was I sat with Mother Ayahuasca, and I had my first experience of God, and then also the other side. And it brought me to a piece of clarity to where I knew what I had to do, but it was the first decision I would have ever made for myself my whole life. And instantaneously, I was like, I have to walk away from this company, not sell it. I have to give it away in 24 hours. And we were a couple weeks away from bankruptcy. Nobody was supportive of it. Nobody, my coaches, my business partners, nobody. And I was like, I don't care. And so I basically called a friend, Josh Trent, who owns Wellness Force. And I was like, hey, man, you're a good man. You have a good audience. Can I just give you this thing in 24 hours? And I walked away. I deleted social media. I changed my phone number. I changed my email. And then I disappeared off the internet for 3.5 years.
Clean break.
And I was done. And, in magical God fashion, now looking back, Jim Quick called me, Sean Stevenson called me, and they're like, hey, we're getting together with friends. We'd love to see you. And I walk into this room of 22 entrepreneurs, and I did not belong anymore. I had no business. We were close to bankruptcy, and ended up answering a question for somebody and then teaching them stuff. And then there were 22 people in the room, and 20 of them hired me as a consultant, and I didn't even know that existed. And then that kind of kick-started this new direction in career of coaching, consulting, marketing, and all of those pieces. And then drove that whole game and got really, really successful, like financially, extremely successful, except I had never addressed or worked on the things underneath. I had this clarity. I took the break and I had worked on myself. Like I had really cared for myself. And then this new career showed up. Sure as crap, jumped right into the same bucket. Massive amounts of success, massive amounts of money. And I was 250 pounds again while everybody was celebrating me and nobody said a word. And I was soulless. Like I have pictures of it. And it looked like my eyes had no color. There was no life in me whatsoever. And just like typical patterns in my life, instead of facing it head on, I slowly eroded it and started walking through this journey. And it ended up leading to a divorce, COVID, losing everything again and having to rebuild it. And that was the first time where it all kind of hit me. And I was like, things get to be different this time and they don't get to happen overnight. And this is going to sound really, really crazy, but like we had like 50, 60 grand a month in overhead. I had 2 homes, like 3 cars, 8 horses, and I had no money left. And I was just like praying. And this was before I even was home with God. And the only clarity that hit me was go for a hike every day until you find clarity. Go for a hike every day until you find clarity. And it was like 21 days. And I get to the top of the mountain one day and it hits me. And I'm like, why have I owned a podcast mic for 8 years and never used it? And that's actually when my podcast was born.
Cool.
And so then I basically just started showing up consistently and started embodying and integrating the things that I had been coaching people with and helping people with. And it was like this slow process. And then over the last couple of years, we've navigated or still navigating like a conscious uncoupling, which allowed healing to happen there and co-parenting. And now I'm in the season of what it feels like building my forever garden and actually tending to it the right way and caring for it the right way. And most importantly, caring for the gardener who's in charge of it. And from a place of like love and acceptance and empathy and care and self-care. As like, I'm the healthiest I've ever been at 40. I'm in the best shape of my life. I have the best relationship. I have a relationship with my son. I have an incredible relationship with so many people that I love. But that would be like kind of the shortest story arc that I could give you of like how I got to today.
Yeah. And there's so much there to unpack. And one of the things I just want to note is how cool is it that we're recording this where we are and how we are and in the season of life that we are. Because if we'd have had this conversation a couple of years ago when I first started following you, that would have looked different.
So different.
And what I love is that your journey is continuing down the road. We talked about this beforehand. There is no destination per se. It's a journey, and you're learning more as you go, and you have that growth mindset that allows you to not play victim, but instead to use what you're going through to better yourself, to better your relationships, and to better your relationship with the Lord.
Oh, brother, I just have one note to add to that before you go, because you know me, you've followed me for years and we've been connected. I've relegated, like I joke with people, I was a Marine, right? So there's only 3 colors of crayons in my box. It's black, white, and pink, right? That's it. Other than that, it's too complicated. And I've relegated my life to fortune cookies and reminders because I can remember them easily. And the way that I would summarize it is that I was so busy being a victim of my life and even bonding over the story of it for so long. And the way that I describe it is I was just more comfortable reading the old book because I was afraid to pick up a pen and write a fresh page.
Wow.
And where I am now and knowing how the human brain works and the human body works, like I have like 35 years of like that old story, that old thing, and it's never eradicated. It's brought into my awareness. But when it comes up, I'm like, oh, this is an invitation for a brand new page of paper, right? It's not read the old story. It's write the present one and choose who I get to be today and tomorrow. And I'd say it's a growth mindset, but I feel like at a deeper level, it's even an integrous relationship with myself and with God for me, of like, the way that I joke about people with this, and I've forever been a believer, but I've been an unapologetic believer, for about 6 months. And I mean like publicly and committed to myself. But I'm like, the way that I describe this to people, and I talk to so many people from so many parts of life. I'm like, have you ever been driving in the car and just randomly you're sitting in traffic and you think of Chad? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, what do you do in that moment? And they're like, well, nothing. And I was like, great. Before you went to bed last night, did you set your intention that you'd be driving down a highway 7 hours later in traffic in a rainstorm and Chad's name would pop into your brain? And they're like, no. I'm like, so why do you think it's there? And they're like, well, I don't know. I'm like, have you ever followed the call? And they're like, well, I don't know. And I think for me, the way that I look at that is like, I haven't installed those thoughts. It's either God, my intuition, my heart, connection, calling me. And I feel like the way that I would describe it is that my job is to pick up the phone when God calls and spend my life picking up more of them than I let pass by or get ignored. And that has probably led to the most amount of happiness that I've ever had.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in that God is speaking to us today, but the thing is, we don't realize it. We're not listening. We're not tuned in, and we don't acknowledge it as one of those divine moments where, hey, there's a reason that thought came to my head, right?
Well, and I'll just call out the elephant in the room, Chad, because I'm like, why can't God just be like, hey, it's me, God, I'm installing this thought, right? Like learning to read between the lines.
Right.
And you know, to your point too, when I went and drank ayahuasca for the first time, the shaman wouldn't let me sit with the medicine. And he was a godly man, like a very, very godly man. And he's like, I won't let you sit with this because you have no purpose for your life. And I was like, well, how the heck am I supposed to find a purpose for my life? Right. And he's like, and he looked me dead in the eye. I will never forget this. His name is Brad. He lives in Michigan. I love him to pieces. Met him in Costa Rica. And like, without missing a beat, he's like, well, when was the last time you were quiet enough to hear God's whispers?
Yeah. Wow.
And I was like, and that has never left me. And then I started, and it was just enough to tilt me, because the other part of that I don't tell people or haven't is when I walked away from that company, I spent 3 years without consuming one piece of content. No books, no movies, no music, like instrumentals were all that were allowed. And it was the most uncomfortable year of my life, because the only person I didn't know how to have a relationship with was myself. And I was doom scrolling, music, movie, Netflix, book, like almost like hiding in every exterior place instead of diving into the interior of my own existence.
Yeah.
And so to your point, that is like the biggest breakthrough I've ever had.
I love that. And I want to dig a little bit into this pattern that I think is, apparent as you tell your story, because I think it's one that's relatable. It almost seemed like a game of whack-a-mole. But that's the phrase that comes to mind. And I say it because I've been there. It's like, all right, having struggles in this area, I'm going to focus on this other area. I'm going to get really lean. All right, I'm going to focus on my body. But then, you'd mentioned that there are other areas in your life that just at that point are completely negligible, that need to be honed in on. So you're focusing on this one area, but overall you're not where you want to be. And then, so you join CrossFit, you got in shape and all these things. And then you mentioned, you fast forward a little bit, now you're 100 pounds overweight. So the physical component is gone. But then you're highly successful in your career. And so you focused on that area and this other area, so it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole, like boom, I got it. And then something else pops up. And then boom, I got it. And something else pops up. That's what I relate to that, because for a large part of my life, that's what it felt like for me in my walk. I would get control. I would hyper fixate on one area of my life, whether it be, spirituality, whether it be physical health, whether it be mindset, whether it be content, whatever. Just, I want to be my best self, right? We hyperfixate on one or two areas, and man, we're blowing it in the rest of them. And as a result, hey, we're winning in these areas we're looking at, but we're failing as a whole. Can you speak to that a little bit? These patterns that kind of repeat themselves in our lives, because I can't think that me and you, George, are the only ones that deal with this.
Nope. And I'm so blessed that you call them patterns, right? So just disclosure for everybody listening, I'm not a psychologist. But to summarize, I was so addicted to healing myself.
Yeah.
And the best movie reference I can give you is Good Will Hunting.
Mm-hmm.
I would learn a modality so that I could eat the therapist for breakfast. And two of my former psychologists became clients of mine. And so I speak of this of like own personal experience. I read the DSM cover to cover. I've studied the brain. I've studied all of these things because I was like, give me something. But to your point, that was my whack-a-mole. I'm like, oh, this isn't working. Let me go be the best at here. I think the most important part is their patterns, right? And like if you study the mind, like our unconscious mind filters something like 3.5 million thoughts a day and only sticks around a couple thousand of them through these ruts and grooves that have kind of been built in habitually with behaviors. And as a human being, biologically, when things get stressed, we freeze. We crave comfort and predictability. And there's a little bit of discomfort needed to be able to grow and maintain. And there's an incredible book on this by Michael Easter called The Comfort Crisis.
Yeah, I love that one.
And Michael's going to come on the podcast because he has another one called Scarcity Brain, but The Comfort Crisis. And really is, you go back 100 years, you go back 30 years, is when there were things out of whack in your life, there weren't distractions to hide it. And if you wanted to call somebody, you had to hope they picked up, wrap the cord around your finger and like leave a voicemail. And then the rest of it, you were like, what am I to get up and change the TV channel, right? There wasn't like these addictive programmings in parts and pieces. So I think there's two parts of this. Number one is that we kind of live in a world now that is created to allow us to stay disconnected from ourselves. Yeah. And so it exacerbates these patterns because it adds rocket fuel to them. And then the other side of it is that, to your point, and my buddy Alex Sharfin has said this for years, and I love this quote, if you're constantly fighting fires, there's a good chance you're the arsonist. And
that's good.
In your life or business. And I'm like, oh, yeah. Because then his second quote that always follows is, you don't have the life or business you want because you haven't become the person to run it yet. And to our earlier point, it's these attachments to the outcome, but not the process itself. And I use this, because I'm a simple man. And I'm like, if you ever watch a UFC fight and you see somebody rise up to the ranks and become the champion, you can tell if they're going to retain that belt based on their post-fight interview and behavior. Because if you watch him and he's like, I made it, I'm the best, I'm going out to party, give me 2 to 3 fights and the belt's gone. Yeah. You see the dude who's like, hey, it was good, I'm going to be back in the gym tomorrow. They tend to maintain the belt the longest because they're addicted to the process and the identity of the process, not the results that it creates. And so, for me, you nailed it. It was like whack-a-mole, right? And it was driven by external validation, not by my own valuation. Yeah. Yeah. And so it was like, hey, if I have this business, I'm valuable. To you and I point, I'm finally good enough. If I look this certain way, people are going to see me a certain way. But it really, really came back to not me acknowledging how I wanted to see, how I wanted to feel, how I wanted to be in alignment at the deepest level. And there was really this addictive behavior and hiding in these parts and pieces. But then, like, this with my content, I say this all the time. The biggest mistake I made is that I overvalued intensity and undervalued consistency. Yeah. And at the speed of life and the pace of life that we live, with the things that happen around us, I realized that most of my life, I was trying to create the illusion of safety by being able to control an outcome when it never existed in the first place. But what I always had the ability to do was to control my inputs and my responses to those situations. But like, the amount of people I meet now, they're like, oh, I'm doing X amount of money, I'm going to be doing it forever. And I was like, you let off the gas pedal 90 days ago. Something's coming. You just don't see it yet, right? And so I think there's this part, like societally with life or with everything, where we fall into that finish line trap. And so it's just easier to get into that coasting mode instead of taking a peek at, oh, maybe that isn't the best for me, or maybe, and I say this with couples all the time too. It's like, if you ever notice, like if you're married or you're in a long-term relationship, how you date now is drastically different than how you dated in the beginning. Right. And we reinvent ourselves those. But where I found the hardest place to look is the mirror. Because there's this semblance of like, oh, well, I can just hide in this relationship. I can hide in this business. I can hide in this goal. I can hide in these pieces. But not because I want to, but because there's some pattern running or some script running where I'm like, well, that's what would make me valuable. That's what would make me of service. That's what would allow X, Y, and Z. And really, the only way that I was ever able, and still to this day, because it's a muscle that we flex all the time, was to actually spend time alone.
Yeah.
And to actually sit with it. Like, like I use my kid's book, because there's this book. I know your son's 5, my son's about to be 8. But I used to read him this book every single night before bed called Bear Through the Woods.
Mm-hmm.
You can't go over it. You can't go under it. You can't go around it. You got to go through it. But I think the mistake that I made for years is going through it, I made as an active action instead of a passive feeling. And it's really just allowing ourselves to process and to feel, and then not take the next 1,000 bites, like just take the next first bite to like bring it into alignment. And the last piece I'll share about this is that I think personally, like anecdotally, if I'm even using that word correctly, you look at the world that we live in now, we're in a world conditioned to not be honest and not feel, right? And I'll give you a tangible example. You walk into a coffee shop or a conference with a ton of people and you ask them how their morning is, they're all going to give you the same answer. Oh, it's great. And I'm like, liar. Like, what do you mean? I'm like, oh, no. I woke up this morning. My dog got run over by a car. I spilled my coffee on my shirt. I was late getting my son out, but I'm choosing to be happy and focus on the next bite is the real integrous answer.
Right.
But it's all these relegated transactions to where like, it's almost like externally we're conditioned to not feel.
Yeah.
But yet our feelings and our intuition are the best barometer that we have. And I'm going to share this because you have a son and you're a man of God. But I have a lot of entrepreneurs who come into my house. All I do is coach entrepreneurs, right? No matter which way I slice it, I swore I'd never be a coach again. And God's like, yeah, okay, cool.
Never say never.
You're a coach, right? And my son was 6, so a year older than your son. And I had a female entrepreneur in my house, and she was talking about how all she wanted was things to be predictable. Like she just wanted them to be consistent in all these pieces. And she was basically like, I just wish it was like there and just existed. So my son walks over and he's like, can I draw something for you? And I've never taught him this, but now I teach it all the time. And she's like, yeah. He grabs a piece of paper and he draws a flat line on the paper. And he's like, if this was your heartbeat, what would it mean? And she's like, oh, it would mean I'm dead. And he's like, okay, cool. And then he draws like an EKG, like an up and down heartbeat. And he's like, if this was your heartbeat, what would it mean? And she's like, that I was alive and thriving. And he looks her dead in the eye and he says, well, that's how your feelings are supposed to be every day. You're supposed to feel up and down because that's what it means to be alive.
Wow.
And I broke down in tears.
Wow.
It took me a month to like let that fully sink in because like that was like divine in its essence. But really, I think we're so conditioned, and you and I were talking about this before the show. It's sad that it's rare to connect with somebody and to be able to share what's actually coming up. And it's almost like it's conditioned to feel unsafe.
Yeah.
And then because of that, we're conditioned over and over in that pattern that if I do feel bad, or if I'm having a hard day, or if it feels like a struggle. No. When was the last time you achieved anything worthwhile when it just showed up and you appreciated it, right? We go on a run. We get near the end of the 3 miles we commit to, and we're like, oh my God, this hurts so bad. And we're like, push, because it will be worth it in the end.
Yep.
But yet when it comes to us as humans, we're like, no, I don't want to feel that. I don't want that in my relationship. I don't want that in my business. But you can't have both, right? There's effort. If you want to cook a recipe, as much as we'd like to hit a button and have it made for us, like you got to peel the potatoes, you got to slice the onions, you got to cry a little bit, you got to cook the process, and the meal is worth the effort that put into it. And so I think the most important thing is like not overcomplicating the process, but also not sensationalizing the process. Right. And just actually choosing the next bite. And even for me, who's been through multiple 12-step programs, one of the favorite things that they ever said to me is like, some days it's minute by minute. And other days it's day by day. And he's like, and if you ever get to a point where you're doing it month by month, you might want to try to chunk it down and make it hour by hour again to make sure that you're heading in the right direction.
Sure. A lot of it kind of seems like it boils down to our definition of success, right?
Yep.
Because to borrow your language, you said a minute ago, it was this it was kind of this portrayal of success. It was a caricature of success. You were looking for success. In order for me to be successful, in order for me to be liked, in order for me to be appreciated, in order for me to be loved, in order for me to be fill in the blank, I've got to look this way, do this thing. It was all results oriented.
Yep.
So at that point in your life, it seemed like success was based on those results. And the place where you landed, and you're there now, and you've realized that success is not necessarily what we do, but it's who we become. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like that in my mind, I try to simplify stuff.
Well, yeah, because I speak a lot about feelings, but you genuinely nailed it. And I was sharing this with my partner, who also is an incredible coach and entrepreneur. And she's like, one of the things that you taught me is that I never had clarity or my vision. And she's like, without you realizing, you basically said, describe my vision without revenue, people, or products. And I couldn't do it, which means I never had one because I was attached to the result. And it's the same thing in our life. And you're right, because on paper, I had this external thing of like, oh, the world thinks I'm successful. And I missed 3 years of my son's life living on airplanes. And if you had to ask me right now if I could go back, what's so crazy is all those things that I achieved, I don't have any of them. They're not in the bank account. They're not in assets. But what I don't have is that 3 years of my son's life back. And so to your point, it's always about what you value as success and like what you value at the deepest level. And like, if you have kids and you're listening to this, like my bonus daughter is also 19. I see her maybe once every 2 weeks and she lives with me. And I'm like looking at it now, and I used to be excited to travel and go speak and go consult. And now the moment it comes up, I get like anxiety in my body because I'm like, this moment's not coming back. Like, I don't get another one of these like nighttime cuddles. I don't get this. Like, there's going to be a point where he doesn't let me hold him like a baby anymore, even though I've conditioned him to say I'm still going to do it when he's 18, right? Like, no matter what. And so it's really at the deepest level, like putting the most amount of weight on what you value, but not in the short term, in the long term. Like, what's the most important thing to you?
Right.
And I was too busy building acquaintanceships and pouring into things that weren't of substance than pouring into the things that truly mattered and brought me the greatest amount of joy, myself being one of them. And then the people I love being the next.
I think there's so much value in that. I think in the men that I interact with on a daily basis in particular, there's a lot of that we face as men. We tend to value ourselves based on what society tells us. We value ourselves based on our results or what the external world tells us. But what we lack, and I want to delve into this part next, if that's okay, what we lack is this ability to have a relationship with ourselves. And one of the things you're big on, one of your slogans is relationships over algorithms. You got the shirt and all that. I've seen all that. That's one of the things that sets you apart because you believe in building a business. It's not about the algorithm. It's about the people. And one of the things you said was, I've learned how to have a relationship with everyone but me. And I think that's so relatable because if you think about it, what are we doing constantly? We're on this. There's been times, George, and I'll be honest with you, I'll be going through my house, I'll be walking up my stairs, and I don't have anything to do in the moment, so I get out my phone and I check my email. Can I just tell you that?
Yep.
There's this really deep truth that we don't like to sit with ourselves. And if you said it this way, if we're always embracing content, if we're always looking for something to keep ourselves and our minds and our hearts occupied, then we're never going to come home, are we? Can you speak to that a little bit?
I sure can. I sure can. And I think the most important point is that it's a spectrum. It's not rigid. There isn't this point where you're like, oh, it's all me all the time, or I'm not going to pick up the phone, right? But I had a Buddhist monk on my podcast, like early days, because he was in my mastermind. His name was Elp Tikin, and I love Elp. This is going to be my invitation to reach back out and check in on him. And he lived in a monastery for 7 years. And I could summarize the entire podcast, 1 hour podcast, in one statement. And he said, if you can't poop without your phone, you've never lived a day in your life.
Wow.
And there's so much wisdom packed under that poop emoji.
Yeah.
That I can't even begin to explain. And of course, like, I feel like I'm a man of service, right? Like, I always pick two words to describe my year. And I think the two words that I'm going to carry through for the rest of my life are humbled servant. Like, I feel like I belong at the feet of every human being washing them, no matter who they are. Like, that is where I belong, is on my knees. But in order to do that, I also have to have a relationship with myself and understand my values and my worth and have some humility and patience to be able to be of service and be useful, right? And I think that, and I consume the most random things, and this is going to sound random, but I'll send you all these clips as well if you want to include them. But
Sure.
There was a podcast clip that Lex Friedman did with John Danaher. And John Danaher is like one of the greatest minds in martial arts and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And Lex Friedman asked him about the meaning of life. And I could not have articulated it better, but the short version is, pre-industrial revolution, we all had two things in common: faith and survival. And so if we woke up and our house burnt down and we lost our water, there wasn't a time to sit still or distract on your phone, or else you and your family weren't going to survive. And so there was this outside pressure that kept us in action. And I also find it convenient that human beings are the only biological creature that doesn't have a natural process to drain their lymphatic system and stress.
Yeah.
But movement is the one.
Yep.
And yet, the one thing that we stop doing when we don't feel good is sit on the phone, doom scroll, watch, which is why we can all think of that time where we're like, I'm just going to the gym, or I'm going for a run. And 10 minutes in, we have some tears and then nothing but clarity in our life, right? And John talked about how we won the game as human beings because we live in comfort. And at every degree, we can control the temperature, we can Uber Eats food, we can go to the grocery store, we can have these things, but it's removed that outside pressure to be able to also create our identities in the lens of like movement or effort or action.
Yeah.
And so for me, this still comes up often, but it doesn't last. I'll find the same moment where I'll be like, holy moly, I realize I'm sitting here with my son watching a show, and then I'm on my phone and I'm like, what am I doing? Oh, got it. Let me be present with my son. And then I'll go tickle him, or I'll go play with him, or I'll go throw him on the, the beanbag. I think the most important thing is it's not this rigid finish line. It's more this process to bring ourselves into alignment, and also this permission slip to recognize that like who I am today is not who I was a week ago, a month ago, or a year ago, but who I am today is dictated by the actions that I take and the inputs that I put into my garden. And there's a lot of freedom in that as well. Because like we say the same thing, like I just, I said this before, but like 2 years ago, I lost 100 pounds and it's off permanently. Like it's not coming back. And the hardest thing that I did was like, oh, I'm overweight. Oh, I'm unhappy. Oh, I'm blank. And all the time I could go look up macros and movement and workouts, but really all I had to do was for 10 minutes, put my shoes on and go for a walk. And everyone asked me like, how'd you lose the 100 pounds? The truth, the treadmill that I had next to my bed.
Wow.
And so I'd have that thought and I just reconditioned it in of like, just go walk on the treadmill in silence. And then in that silence, I'm like, oh my God, like, I can't believe I put this off. Like, look at me doing this, right? I think having a relationship with yourself is not this woo-woo practice of like, I just sit still.
Right.
It's finding a connection to ourselves and choosing habits, behaviors, and actions that align us to who we want to be in the future, not the story we're telling ourselves of who we are in the present. And it just requires, and I'll what about Bob this because we're close in age, baby steps. And I've learned to love myself through evidence, but evidence only comes with action. The action just has to be aligned with who I am and who I want to be. And one of those that you acknowledged early on is I've made a declaration to myself that I never want to hide behind falsehoods. And so that means that even though I coach millionaires and billionaires and help people get there, and I've been one on paper myself and just lost it all again through a new process, and I'm rebuilding it day by day, and I'm close to being back, I'm going to tell people the truth about how I feel in that moment or what my results look like, because that is what I value in being authentically connected. And I never want anybody to feel like I'm different than them because we put our pants on the same. And so I think it's more of this active choice of choosing ourselves. Like I say this all the time with food, like the fork didn't make me fat. Me putting it in my mouth over and over and not acknowledging how I felt is what made me fat. Right? I can't blame the fork. I can't blame the table. I can't blame the person. And I shouldn't be blaming myself. I should be having love and grace for myself because I've brought it into my awareness. And then the question is, okay, what would you like to do about it? And if it's important enough, I'll do something about it. And sometimes that's just small micro bites. But I think there's this exploration of self that's really missing. And for everybody, it's different. Like Thich Nhat Hanh was a big influence on me, one of the Buddhist monks, because I was like, I can't meditate. And he's like, meditating is not just sitting there going goose fraba. It's like, hey, go for a walk and just notice your foot hitting the ground. Like when you drive in the car, drive in silence and see what comes up. When you wake up in the morning, protect your morning and allow it to be yours, not driven by your phone. But wake up for 10 minutes and just go look out the door or stand barefoot in the grass. It's not this complicated process. It's these moments of tuning in and also accepting all of what you feel. Like even before we recorded, for everybody listening, I was crying to Chad. And it wasn't from a place of victim or story. I was just expressing my emotions. And then I'm like, all right, bro, I'm ready. I'm sweaty. Let's go do this podcast. But it feels like these microbites. And I think children are the absolute best teachers. You know this better than ever. I will watch my son at the playground have a best friend, become a mortal enemy, get a wound that convinces him he's going to the ER, re-become best friends with that person and go through that process 6 times in 20 minutes. And then he's like, Dad, that was the best park experience ever. Can we go back tomorrow? And I'm like,
feeling all the things.
Cool. And so I think, and I know that's kind of like an esoteric answer, but in the same vein, I think being a human being requires being, but also actions that are aligned with who we want to be. There's not this passive. And I've done this. Like I have those weeks that are really hard and I'm like, all right, I'm just going to chill on the couch and watch YouTube podcasts all day. Right. I make it 20 minutes in before I'm like, you know what? Maybe I should do my laundry. Like, you know, maybe I should go food prep. Like maybe I should go take my son to the park. Right. And there's this call that like, we're given this gift of life and we're not getting it back. Like the clock is ticking. And every moment we have the ability to plant a seed or water a seed that's in our garden. But every moment that passes is a moment missed or a harvest missed or a piece of food missed in the future. And, you know, I've said this before and one of my friends said it to me the other day and he's like, just as a reminder, you're living in the results of the actions and choices you made 90 days ago. So what are you choosing today? And I'm like, oh, are you really using my own stuff against me now? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, thank you. Right. So I think it's this active choice of like, to complete the loop on the John Danaher thing is when we had that comfort installed, it took away those 2 shared meanings that everybody had. And the reason I recommended the book, The Comfort Crisis, is because it talks about adding that pressure back but from a place of fulfillment and from a place of alignment and finding ourselves in the process of things and not getting attached to the results.
Sure. And so in my mind, and others have said this more eloquently, but in my mind, not the mind of George, but the mind of Chad, I see this as a couple of different ways that we deal with this. So there's unawareness. There's this place where we're just kind of going through life. We're not, you know, maybe we're just kind of,
here we come.
Yeah, right. Exactly. We're stuck in this rut. But we're not really aware of what caused it. We're not aware of the patterns. We're not aware of these things. Then then we become aware of that.
Yep.
Right. And we have a choice at that point.
Yep.
A lot of times the choice that we choose is self-blame.
Yep.
Shame, judgment. And what does that do? That perpetuates the whole thing, right?
Yep.
And so the key is once you become aware of the patterns that are in place, the habits that are in place that are no longer serving you, then it becomes time to just say, you know what? I'm not going to stay in this place of self-despair. I'm not going to blame myself. I'm not going to talk about how dumb I am. I'm not going to talk about any of these things. I'm not going to let that negative self-talk creep in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the actions that align with the person I want to be. And that's exactly, you said that so beautifully with your story. And I love how you talked about the fact that it takes actions, but it has to be aligned with who we are becoming, with who we want to be. Action for the sake of action is not a net win. And so if you're taking action based on who you want to become, who God put you on this earth to become, then I think that is the ticket.
Yeah. I want to say something, because I think there's a difference. I think when we're responding to the past from fault, blame, guilt, or shame, it's not action, it's reaction.
Yep, that's good.
Action is fresh, reaction is old. And what you spoke to is, for everybody, if you want to go look up the 4 stages of competence, the words are really, really big. I summarize them down for my marine brain, but the 4 stages of growth as a human being is unaware, aware, learning, and mastery.
That's good.
And if you've ever read Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, the mistake that people make is the journey doesn't end when you slay the dragon. The journey ends when you return to the village to teach the lesson, and then the new dragon appears.
Wow.
Right? So when you understand this, is that you nailed it, right? Like, when we go from unaware to aware, we've been given the greatest gift ever. Because if a triage nurse has somebody walk in who's convinced that they're dying, but then presents their symptoms and is like, no, you're just having an anxiety attack.
Yep.
Here's what to do. It's the greatest gift in the world. Well, when we have our internal barometer, whether it's your thoughts, your habits, your behaviors, or the results around us that bring to our presence that something is out of whack or out of alignment, or we're aware, the only thing that perpetuates that rumination cycle is fault, blame, guilt, and shame. But you didn't know before. It's the greatest gift ever to become aware. And it doesn't advocate us of the next actions that we take, but it is an invitation, because once you become aware, and it's like getting unplugged from the matrix, once you see, you can't unsee. And everything past that point is either evidence that's going to build your confidence and self-love because you're taking small bites towards it, or evidence to feed that perpetuating cycle of, look, I can't.
Yeah, so good.
And it's when you catch yourself in that trap. And the part that I had to really, really dig myself into was that going from unaware to aware happens quick. But once you're aware, then action is the next step. And even if you go through traditional therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy or processing therapy, the whole point is to allow you to exist with your triggers until they no longer control your emotions and behaviors, so that you can take an action in the opposite direction. Well, welcome to speeding up the process. The moment you become aware, the choice is like, what's just the one next bite? What's the one next piece? And that's in the learning bucket. And the learning bucket is the one that sticks around the most, because it requires some semblance of discipline, right? Like, you don't go to the gym on day one and be like, I'm so bummed I don't have abs, I'm never going to the gym again, right? So whether it's a journaling practice or a walking practice or a meditation practice or changing one thing in your diet, right? The same way of like, oh, I don't want to eat sugar anymore. Well, if you go cut it all out, you're coming right back. Like, what's one thing you can make today? Like, what's one cup of water you can add? Same thing with writing. Like, I want to learn how to write. Well, you have to learn how to crawl before you walk, before you run. So where can you consistently protect that? And the process of, like, whether you're future self journaling or going through those 4 stages of competence, is you live in that learning bucket, which requires us to use our environment, the people around us, our support system, to hold us accountable to those actions until it becomes our identity. And then you're in mastery. And then it's, what do I want to add next? Or what level do I want to take deeper? Right? Like, just like podcasting, right? Like, I've been on like 10,000 shows, and like I have 600 of my own. Like, I don't necessarily have to prep for my podcast or for an interview, but it's really interesting because I went and looked at the data and the feedback and some of the show structure, and everyone's like, God, if you added this or added this. So now I'm back to making notes for my podcast. And I'm like, here's the outline I'm going to follow. Here's what I'm going to hit to give it structure, right? And it's like this new level of awareness unlock. And I'm having to make those until it just becomes how I do them. And then I move on to the next one. And so I think there's this like invitation for everybody to baby step your way through it in any single bucket, right? Like the race only begins when you take the first step.
Yeah.
And if you constantly move the starting line, then you're just delaying the results and the evidence needed in the process that helps you bring it into alignment. And so I love and now crave this semblance of practice, but it also makes me drastically uncomfortable. Drastically uncomfortable, right? Like I took my social media back over and my team's been running it for years, but I'm like, I feel like it's missing me. It's missing me. And I'm like, how do you guys post stories in 10 minutes? It took me 2.5 hours. Like what is going on? And then that is kind of like this process that's been like, oh, I get to learn again. I get to be a student again. I get to be, humble and play this game. And it reminds me of a quote that same shaman Brad said to me. And he said, a student says, I already know. And a master says, thanks for the reminder. And I think if you really boil it down, life should be a constant series of reminders to come back to the basics for us to embody and master, never thinking we're going to finish the game. And I think that that's where the game is won and lost. It's in this application of practice over and over and over again. And I think that that's the part that I'm focusing on the most of like, I only feel valuable to even myself when I'm creating something or I'm in process of something, but for me and for my son and the example I want to be. And that's going to have its series of growth, because the same way with the gym. Like if I go to the gym and I'm like lifting and I'm like, oh, I don't feel this. I don't feel this. I don't feel this. And I do that for 3 months. I'm not plateauing. I'm getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And I'm like, then why am I in the process?
Right.
There's this semblance of like understanding that like we get to grow, we get to create meaning in any area of our life. It's applicable. But I think that that's how I choose to see it now.
Awesome. So much gold right there. I appreciate you walking through that with us. I'm going to ask you to take us home with this. George, I could talk to you for hours.
Yeah, me too, brother. Me too.
This is good. What piece of advice, what single piece of advice would you give to any of our listeners out there? They're in a place where they're just not satisfied with who they are. They're not satisfied with life as they know it. They know there has to be something better out there. And I know it's a loaded question, but where would you say they start? What would be a good place to say, I'm going to move a step in the right direction?
I love that question. And I'm just going to let my heart lead this answer.
Sure.
The short answer is I'd start in the mirror. And it starts by loving the reflection that you see first, but intentionally creating space for new. If I plant a seed right now, I cannot be frustrated that if I water it today, I don't get a strawberry tonight.
Right.
And so it's allowing ourselves to accept where we are. Right. And the easy analogy for this is if you open Google Maps or Apple Maps on your phone and you put in the destination of where you want to go and you hit go, it's going to say, I can't get you there. Tell me where you are. And everybody tries to surpass the current state.
Yeah.
But without the current state and knowing where you are, you cannot begin the process to get to the future state of your destination.
That's so good.
And so look in the mirror and forgive yourself and realize that every single choice, every single action, every single behavior, every single moment is what brought us to this moment. But if you have that awareness, you also now have every ingredient in the kitchen to start cooking whatever recipe that you want next, as long as you love the ingredients that are in front of you.
Wow. Yeah. Love it, man. We need to do a part 2 of this.
Done.
I need to. I've got so many things to ask, but where can my listeners find you, George? You're all over the place. You've got a lot of different things going on. But
I am all over the place, and here's the thing, Chad will tell you this. I genuinely love connecting with people.
He does.
So like, if you have a question, if you have a thought, if you need a safe space to share anything, just DM me on Instagram. I'm the only one on my Instagram. My Instagram is It's George Bryant, and the It's is included. It's a part of it. ITSGeorgebryant. And then the other best place to find me everywhere, including the podcast, is mindofgeorge.com, the pinkest website you'll ever see. My favorite color. I love it.
It is.
Walking Pattern Interrupt, but the podcast is up there. All our stuff is linked there, and just genuinely here to be of service. And so if I can support you, if I can answer a question, if you need a safe space, you're like, hey, I just want to share this with you and nobody else, send it my way. Cone of silence over here. I will just pray for you, let it in, and see if I can support you in any way, but it would mean the world to me. So yeah, Instagram and my website, mindofgeorge.com.
Thank you, George. You're an influencer in a lot of different ways. You're a man of faith. I love talking about that. Maybe we can do that in part 2.
Yeah.
More than anything, you're an open book, and you're making a difference in this world by modeling and setting an example of transparency and honesty and humility. So I just want to end by saying, thank you, my friend. You're a blessing, and keep being great.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you for listening to the RevRx podcast. We hope you enjoyed what you heard today, and if so, we'd love it if you would hit that subscribe button so that you'll never miss a new episode from us. Also, feel free to leave us reviews and comments, as we'd love to hear from you. Be blessed and be the very best you.